I thought my life was perfect, a loving husband, a stable family. But one slip of my tank top in the garage set off a chain of events I could never have imagined. The way my stepson looked at me that day changed everything. My name is Rachel, and for most of my life, I believed I had built a picture-perfect existence. At 45, I was married to Mark, a successful businessman whose career kept him away from home more often than not. Our life together seemed ideal to the outside world. A spacious home, financial stability, and all the trappings of a marriage that others might envy. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. Mark and I had been married for 8 years. When we exchanged vows, I thought I was stepping into a fairy tale. But along with the husband, I gained a stepson, Dylan, who was just 15 at the time. He was quiet, awkward, and kept to himself, a typical teenager navigating his own struggles. I kept my distance, unsure of how to navigate the delicate role of being his stepmother. Over the years, Dylan grew up. He graduated college, moved back home to save money while starting his career, and transformed into someone almost unrecognizable. At 23, he was no longer the shy boy I once knew. He had become tall, confident, and carried an air of self-assurance that was hard to ignore. Meanwhile, my marriage had fallen into a routine, distant and predictable. Mark's long hours at work left little room for intimacy or connection. The few moments we did spend together were polite but cold, like two people sharing a space rather than a life. Loneliness became my constant companion, and though I never admitted it to myself, I began craving something more, something I couldn't define. Despite our distant relationship, I had always told myself I was lucky to have stability. But that Saturday afternoon in the garage proved otherwise. It started with something so small, organizing clutter and trying to tame my hair. Dylan had offered to help, though his version of helping involved leaning against a workbench with his phone. I had grown used to doing things on my own, but his presence that day felt different. Unspoken tension lingered in the air, and when I caught him watching me, something shifted. A spark I didn't want to acknowledge. That moment would change everything, setting off a chain reaction I couldn't stop. That Saturday afternoon in the garage should have been like any other. Mark was out of town on yet another business trip, and I decided to finally tackle the mess in the garage, dusty boxes and years of accumulated junk. Dylan had offered to help, though his version of helping mostly involved scrolling through his phone and occasionally making sarcastic remarks. I didn't mind. I was used to managing things on my own. But something felt different that day. It started with the small things, his glances that lingered a little too long, the subtle shift in his tone when he spoke to me. I brushed it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. Yet, when the strap of my tank top slipped off my shoulder and I caught Dylan staring at me, the tension became undeniable. His eyes lingered on me in a way I couldn't ignore, and for the first time, I felt a heat rise in the air that had nothing to do with the summer sun. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting, awkward moment, but as the day went on, it became harder to dismiss. Dylan stood closer than usual when we worked, his arm brushing mine more than once. His gaze held an intensity one wasn't used to, one that left me flustered and searching for an escape. By the time we finished organizing, my heart was racing for reasons I didn't want to admit. That evening, I replayed the events in my head as I sat alone in the living room with a glass of wine. I told myself I was being ridiculous, reading too much into harmless glances. But deep down, I knew there was something there, something I couldn't fully understand but couldn't ignore either. It wasn't just Dylan, it was me. The way I reacted to his presence, the way my heart raced under his gaze, left me questioning everything. The following days were a blur of mixed signals and avoidance. I busied myself around the house, hoping to keep a safe distance from him. But Dylan was always there, his presence constant and impossible to ignore. I caught him watching me from across the room, his expression unreadable, and every time our eyes met, the unspoken tension between us grew heavier. I tried to rationalize his behavior. Perhaps it was just my imagination, a result of my own loneliness and the strained state of my marriage. But then there were moments I couldn't explain away, like the time he stood too close while helping me in the kitchen, his hand brushing mine as I chopped vegetables. Or the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, a subtle warmth that made my stomach flutter. I began avoiding being alone with him, retreating to my room or finding excuses to leave the house. But no matter how much space I tried to put between us, it didn't matter. Dylan found ways to linger. Whether it was a casual comment or a simple glance, he was always there, and I couldn't escape the growing tension. One evening, Mark called from out of town, his voice distant as he discussed another business deal. As he spoke, I glanced across the living room to where Dylan sat, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. I realized then that the cracks in my marriage weren't just caused by Mark's absence. They were a reflection of something far deeper. Something I was now dangerously close to stepping into. I told myself it was wrong, that I needed to stop whatever this was before it went any further. But each time I saw Dylan, each time his presence filled the room, my resolve weakened. The tension between us was undeniable, and no matter how much I tried to fight it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to give. The tension between Dylan and me was a fire smoldering beneath the surface, one I was determined to extinguish. I avoided him as much as I could, limiting our interactions to polite, detached conversations. But it didn't matter. The more I tried to distance myself, the stronger the pull became, like gravity drawing me towards something I knew I shouldn't want. One morning, I walked into the kitchen after a sleepless night, still lost in thought. Dylan was already there, shirtless, his hair tousled from sleep. He turned to me with a casual smile, his voice warm as he said, "Morning." "Morning," I replied, focusing on the coffee machine, trying to keep my composure. But as I poured my coffee, I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze impossible to ignore. "You've been quiet," he said, his tone soft but probing. "Since the garage. Is everything okay?" I froze for a moment, my mind scrambling for a response. "I'm fine," I said lightly, forcing a laugh. "Just tired. The garage was a lot of work." He chuckled, stepping closer to lean against the counter beside me. "You know, you're stronger than you look." I glanced at him, caught off guard by the compliment. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, the air between us felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. I quickly turned away, muttering something about needing to check emails, and fled the room. But my heart betrayed me, racing in my chest as though I had run a marathon. The days passed, and no matter how hard I tried to maintain boundaries, Dylan seemed to find ways to blur them. He was always there, whether it was fixing something around the house, casually brushing past me in the hallway, or sitting just close enough for our knees to touch during a shared moment on the couch. Each small interaction felt like a test of my resolve, one I was failing miserably. Then came the day in the garage. I had just returned from yoga, still in my leggings and tank top, when I found Dylan working on his car. The open garage door let the summer sun pour in, bathing the space in a warm glow. "Need help?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. He looked up, his eyes flicking over me before he smiled. "Sure, if you don't mind holding this." I stepped closer, taking the wrench he handed me. His fingers brushed mine, and the jolt of electricity that followed sent a shiver down my spine. As I steadied the wrench, I felt him move closer, his presence undeniable. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, and the intensity in his eyes stopped me cold. "You felt it too, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have walked away. I should have said something to end it right there. But I didn't. Instead, I stood frozen as he stepped closer, his hand brushing against my arm. "Dylan," I began, but the words caught in my throat as he leaned in, his lips finding mine in a kiss that left no room for doubt. It was a kiss that broke every rule, every boundary, and yet I couldn't pull away. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer as my heart raced, drowning out the voice in my head screaming that this was wrong. For the first time in years, I felt alive, consumed by a desire that was both exhilarating and terrifying. When the kiss ended, we stood there, breathless and staring at each other. "This we can't," I stammered, shaking my head. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't ready to stop, and deep down I knew I wasn't either. The kiss in the garage was just the beginning. The days that followed were filled with stolen glances, whispered conversations, and fleeting touches that sent my pulse racing. Every encounter was charged with an intensity that left me dizzy, caught between guilt and longing. I told myself it was a mistake, that it wouldn't happen again, but the truth was, I didn't want it to stop. One evening, Mark was out of town, and I found myself alone in the living room, nursing a glass of wine. Dylan walked in, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. He sat beside me, his knee brushing against mine as he turned to look at me. "This thing between us," he said softly. "You feel it too, don't you?" I opened my mouth to deny it, to shut him down, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I leaned into him, my lips finding his in a kiss that sealed the truth I had been running from. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness. It was something deeper, something I couldn't fight. As the kiss deepened, I felt the last shred of my resolve crumble. Dylan made me feel seen, desired, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. And no matter how wrong it was, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. I thought I could keep everything under control, that the moments Dylan and I shared could remain our secret, locked away from the rest of the world. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and the line we crossed in the garage was just the beginning of our descent. It was a Friday evening when everything came crashing down. Mark had returned home earlier than expected from a business trip, his mood unusually light as he talked about landing a major deal. The three of us sat in the living room, Mark engrossed in his laptop, while Dylan and I exchanged cautious glances across the room. The weight of our shared secret pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. Mark's phone buzzed, and he stepped out onto the patio to take the call. Dylan and I were left alone, the silence between us unbearable. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I glanced at him, the intensity in his gaze made my stomach twist. It wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something I was too afraid to name. "You're too quiet," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm fine," I replied, my tone clipped, hoping to end the conversation. But Dylan didn't look away. Instead, he leaned forward, his hand brushing against mine as he whispered, "You don't have to pretend with me." My breath caught in my throat, but before I could respond, the sound of the patio door opening shattered the moment. Mark walked back in, his presence an unwelcome reminder of the reality I was trying so desperately to escape. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Mark slept soundly beside me. The guilt gnawed at me, but so did the memory of Dylan's touch, his words, his gaze. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. The next morning, Mark left early for a golf game with a client, leaving Dylan and me alone in the house. I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to keep my thoughts focused on mundane tasks. But Dylan found me there, leaning against the counter as he watched me with that same unwavering intensity. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but soft. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, refusing to meet his gaze. But he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he said, "You can't keep running from this. From us?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "There is no us," I said firmly, though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. But Dylan didn't back down. Instead, he leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper as he said, "You can lie to yourself, but you can't lie to me. I see the way you look at me, Rachel. I feel it every time we're in the same room." I should have walked away, but instead, I stood frozen as he reached for me, his hand cupping my cheek. "This is wrong," I whispered, my voice trembling. But when his lips found mine, all my objections melted away. The kiss was intense, consuming, and for a moment I forgot about everything, Mark, the consequences, the guilt. We were so lost in the moment that neither of us heard the front door open. It wasn't until Mark's voice rang out from the hallway that reality came crashing down around us. "Rachel? Dylan? Where are you?" I pulled away from Dylan, panic flooding my veins. "He's not supposed to be back yet," I whispered, my heart pounding. Dylan's face was unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of defiance, as though he was ready to face whatever was coming. Mark appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Nothing," I said quickly, my voice too high-pitched to sound convincing. "We were just talking." But Mark wasn't convinced. His eyes moved between us, lingering on the way I avoided his gaze and the tension that hung thick in the air. "Talking," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "What about?" I scrambled for an answer, but Dylan spoke before I could. "It's nothing, Dad. Just some stuff about the house." Mark's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he crossed his arms over his chest. "I'm not an idiot," he said sharply. "Something's going on here." The room fell silent, the weight of his words suffocating. I could feel the ground beneath me beginning to crumble, the fragile web of lies I had spun threatening to unravel completely. "I think we should all sit down," Mark said finally, his tone cold and commanding. He motioned for us to follow him into the living room, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized there was no escaping this. We sat in tense silence as Mark paced the room, his expression a storm of emotions, confusion, anger, betrayal. "Rachel," he said finally, his voice strained. "What's going on between you and Dylan?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could explain away the situation. But there was nothing. Nothing I could say that would erase the truth, or the guilt etched across my face. Dylan, however, didn't flinch. "Dad," he said calmly, his voice steady. It's not what you think. Oh, really? Mark snapped, his voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell looks like something's going on. The tension in the room was unbearable, the silence deafening. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Mark, I said softly, my voice breaking. But before I could finish, Mark's phone buzzed on the coffee table, the sudden sound cutting through the air like a knife. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening before he grabbed it and walked out of the room, leaving Dylan and me alone once again. I turned to Dylan, my chest heaving as I fought to steady my breath. This has to stop, I whispered, my voice trembling. It's over. But Dylan didn't respond. Instead, he reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. And in that moment, I realized the truth. No matter how hard I tried to resist, no matter how much I wanted to undo everything, I was already in too deep. The house felt heavier in the days that followed, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. Mark's suspicions lingered in the air, though he didn't press me further after that tense conversation in the living room. But his silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. I could feel the weight of his gaze whenever we were in the same room, his unspoken questions louder than words. Dylan, on the other hand, was unrelenting. He acted as though nothing had changed, as though the confrontation had never happened. He smiled, joked, and found ways to linger near me, his presence a constant reminder of the line we had crossed. But the tension between us had taken on a sharper edge. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch, felt like a gamble I wasn't sure I could win. One evening, Mark came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, the monotony of the task a welcome distraction. Dylan walked in, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment before he grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter. The air between us crackled with unspoken tension. Mark entered the room moments later, his footsteps heavy with exhaustion. "Smells good," he said, his voice devoid of the usual warmth. "Thanks," I replied, forcing a smile as I turned back to the stove. But I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and probing, as though he was searching for answers I wasn't ready to give. "Dylan," Mark said suddenly, his tone firm. "Can I talk to you for a minute? In the office?" Dylan hesitated, his gaze flicking toward me before he nodded. "Sure," he said casually, setting his glass down and following Mark out of the room. The sound of the office door closing sent a shiver down my spine. My hands trembled as I stirred the pot in front of me, my mind racing with possibilities. What would Mark say? What did he know? My stomach churned with a mix of fear and guilt, the walls of my carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. When Dylan returned, his face was unreadable. He walked past me without a word, disappearing into his room and closing the door behind him. Mark didn't mention the conversation when he returned to the kitchen, but his silence was louder than any confrontation. The evening passed in uneasy quiet, the tension thick enough to choke on. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, his voice cut through the darkness. "Rachel," he said, his tone low but steady. "Is there something you're not telling me?" My heart stopped. I swallowed hard, my mind scrambling for an answer. "What do you mean?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "You've been distant," he said, his words measured. "And I can't shake the feeling that something's off." I turned to face him, the moonlight filtering through the curtains casting a pale glow across his face. "Mark," I began, my voice trembling. "I'm just tired. You've been working so much, and it's been hard managing everything here on my own." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. "If there's something wrong, you can tell me," he said softly. "I know," I replied, my chest tight with guilt. But the truth was I couldn't tell him. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were a blur of strained interactions and sleepless nights. Dylan avoided Mark as much as possible, and I did everything I could to keep my distance from both of them. But the guilt weighed heavily on me, suffocating in its intensity. Every time Mark kissed me goodbye before leaving for work, every time he asked me how my day had been, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my own betrayal. One afternoon, as I sat alone in my office, the sound of a knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. "Come in," I said, my voice unsteady. Dylan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His expression was serious, his eyes searching mine as he said, "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, my tone clipped. "This has to stop, Dylan. It's over." But he didn't back down. "You don't mean that," he said softly, his voice steady. "I know you don't." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I shook my head. "It's wrong," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for mine. "Rachel," he said, his voice filled with a mix of desperation and determination. "I don't regret anything. And I don't think you do either." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I pulled my hand away, my heart pounding as I said, "You don't understand. This isn't just about us. It's about Mark. About everything we've built. I can't destroy that." Dylan's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with an intensity that made my chest ache. "Then why does it feel like this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. Instead, I turned away, my tears spilling over as I whispered, "It doesn't matter how it feels. It's over." As Dylan left the room, the weight of my decision settled over me like a lead blanket. I had made my choice, but the consequences of my actions were far from over. The cracks in my marriage, the guilt that gnawed at my soul, and the lingering connection I couldn't fully sever from Dylan. All of it was a storm I wasn't sure I could weather. In the days that followed, I tried to rebuild the life I had nearly destroyed. The stolen moments with Dylan haunted me, replaying in my mind like a relentless loop. Every glance from Mark, every touch of his hand, was a reminder of the betrayal I carried in silence. The weight of it pressed down on me, an invisible burden I could never confess. Dylan kept his distance after our last conversation. He avoided me in the hallways, ate his meals at odd hours, and spent more time out of the house. It was a relief, in a way, but also a painful reminder of the connection I had let grow unchecked. I told myself this was for the best, that distancing ourselves was the only way to salvage the fragile balance of my marriage. But the truth was I missed him. I missed the way he made me feel alive, seen, and wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. Mark, oblivious to the chaos beneath the surface, continued his routine of long workdays and distant conversations. But something had shifted between us. The cracks in our marriage, once easy to ignore, now felt like gaping chasms. I couldn't unsee the ways we had drifted apart, the ways his absence had created a void I had tried to fill in the worst possible way. One evening, as Mark and I sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence between us was deafening. He looked up from his plate, his brow furrowed. "Rachel," he said softly, his tone hesitant. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. My fork froze midway to my mouth, and I set it down slowly, avoiding his gaze. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "You've been different lately," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Distant. I can't help but feel like, I don't know, like you're not here with me anymore." My chest tightened, and for a moment, I considered telling him everything. The weight of my guilt felt unbearable, and the thought of unburdening myself was tempting. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I forced a smile, shaking my head. "I'm just tired," I said softly. "Work, the house, everything, it's a lot sometimes." Mark studied me for a long moment, and I wondered if he could see through the cracks in my facade. But he didn't press further, instead nodding and returning to his meal. The conversation left me hollow, a reminder of the distance I had created not just with Dylan, but with the man I had vowed to love and honor. That night, as I lay awake beside Mark, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about the woman I had become, a woman I barely recognized. The guilt of my actions with Dylan, the emotional void in my marriage, and the longing for something more, all tangled together in a web I couldn't untangle. I knew I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. In the weeks that followed, I made a conscious effort to rebuild my relationship with Mark. I started small, cooking his favorite meals, sitting with him in the evenings instead of retreating to my office, asking about his day and genuinely listening. It wasn't easy. The distance between us felt insurmountable at times, but I knew I had to try. If there was any chance of saving our marriage, I had to put in the work. Dylan eventually moved out, taking a job in another city. His departure was bittersweet, a quiet goodbye that left a void in the house and in my heart. As I watched him drive away, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that the temptation was finally gone, and sorrow for the connection we had shared, a connection that had both awakened and shattered me. In the end, I learned a hard truth about myself and the life I had built. Love, trust, and commitment are fragile things, easily broken but not so easily mended. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and the scars of that choice would stay with me forever. But I also learned that healing is possible, even in the face of betrayal, healing for myself, for my marriage, and for the woman I wanted to become. Mark and I weren't perfect, but we were trying. And in that effort, I found a glimmer of hope. A reminder that even in the wake of mistakes, there is a chance to rebuild, to rediscover the love that first brought us together, and to create a future worth fighting for. If you were in Rachel's shoes, what would you have done? Could you resist the pull of forbidden temptation, or would the cracks in your marriage drive you to cross the line? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another shocking story. You won't believe what's coming next.